And I had written this or saved it as the making of an understanding heart. Having an understanding heart. You know, in our country, we have what many believe is the best judicial system in the world. And here, just this past week, we saw where, we had a women basketball player that had gotten arrested over in Russia for having some legal substance or what have you. I don't know all the details, but she had been being held for a long time, and there was an exchange, and she's now free. And for what she was caught with, she was going to have to serve a long time in Russia. And I can imagine, I've never personally been in jail, but I would imagine the jails in America are a lot better than the jails in Russia. And so, as an American, we a lot of times boast about our judicial system. Now, we have the best system in the world, but we all know it's not perfect. There have, of course, been people before that have been found guilty of things that they were innocent of, and that's very unfortunate. But, our judicial system is where we go to solve our problems, but it's also a huge business. I know with my parents, they both loved watching Blue Bloods and all the various cop shows, and I think that's just something we all grow up doing. You love to see the bad guy get caught, right? But then you also have shows like, I remember when I was growing up, I think it was called Court TV, and today it's Judge Judy and stuff like that. People, it's also a business. It's not just all seriousness. But, these shows give us an adequate, view somewhat of what our judicial system is like, not what God's judicial system is like. And, one of the things that even in the video that we just watched that Neil showed is the ability to know a person's heart. Well, that's where you and I come really short because we're unable to really see a person's heart completely, well, unlike Christ is able to or God is able to. And that's one of the reasons why our judicial system is not perfect, is because we don't have the ability to look at a person's heart. But, one of the things that you'll see in front of a courthouse many times, and you've probably seen the statue before, is the woman holding the scales, and she's blindfolded. And this is actually a Roman goddess of justice. I wrote this down. And the goddess of justice originates all the way back to Egypt, where it was believed that she assisted Osiris in the judgment of the dead by weighing their hearts. So, blindfolded, putting their hearts in the scales. Now, the problem with that is if you're going to technically weigh someone's heart, they're already dead, right? So it doesn't matter how you whether you find them guilty or not, they're both dead now. So anyway, that was a joke. So, okay. But let's forward to today. Tough crowd today. So let's go to Matthew chapter 27. I bet the people online really liked it. So Matthew chapter 27 and verse 19, that's where we're going to start reading. And 27 verse 19. And, when you think about this justice statue with her eyes covered and is that really how you would want to be judged if you were on trial for some terrible thing? Would you want the person looking there judging you to be blind? I mean, no, you would want them to be able to see all the facts and, weigh the truths and the false statements and what have you. But in verse 19, we read, now, as he sat on the judgment seat, his wife sent a message to him saying, let there be nothing between you and this righteous man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. And this is talking about Christ. But the chief priest and the elders persuaded in the multitudes to demand Barabbas and to destroy Jesus. And then the governor answered and said to them, which of these two do you desire to be released? And they said, Barabbas. We know Barabbas was a murderer. And so here we have Christ and Barabbas, the two scales going on here. And who's going to be released? And Pilate, who's in control, what then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? And they all said to him, let him be crucified. And the governor said, why? What evil did he commit? But they shouted all the more, saying, let him be crucified. Now Pilate seeing that he was accomplishing nothing, but that a riot was developing instead. And see, that's the interesting thing here. It wasn't really interested about what was right or wrong, but there was a riot starting to develop, and the majority was going to win. And the majority was hollering for Barabbas to be released and for Christ to be crucified. And then Pilate does this thing that we've seen on many of the, Jesus movies over the year. He took water, he washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am guiltless of the blood of this righteous man. You see it. Now think about that for a moment. Was Pilate, him washing his hands, did that really make him guiltless? Absolutely not, it didn't. Because he knew that Christ was innocent and he was in a place of authority, but he was a coward. He was a coward to the mob. And so he did the little washing to clear his conscience. But in essence, it really didn't do anything. The innocent of Christ, or the process of him being crucified was beginning. And when we look there a little closer in 24, Pilate he's allowing a just man to be murdered. And why? Because the people in the streets were screaming. And he was also allowing a murderer to be let go because the people in the streets were demanding it. Let's go over to Exodus chapter 18. And that's not righteous judgment. That's not the kind of judgment that we want to see, right? But even in our country, back over the years, and probably even, I couldn't tell you when the last time, there's been times where people that it was pretty obvious were guilty, but due to their prestige or their power or their position, they were let go. And we have a pretty good judicial system compared to other countries. But what we look at here, even that system that was in Rome at that time, it allowed Christ to be crucified. And we know that this was supposed to happen. That was one of the reasons why Christ came. But in Exodus chapter 18 and verse 13, we're going to read a few scriptures here. And it says, on the next day it came to pass that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning to the evening. And so, Moses had a lot of work cut out for him. And he was having to make judgments of where the people couldn't get along or had things they couldn't decide. And in 14, and when Moses' father-in-law saw this, he said, what is this thing that you do for the people? Why do you sit alone by yourself and all the people stand by you from morning to evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me and to inquire of God. When they have a matter, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. That's one of the songs we sang today, how much we love God's law. And so Moses knew God's law, and so he was able to make righteous judgment. But the problem was, it was just too much for one man. And that's what his father-in-law was trying to bring to him. And Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. You will surely wear away, both of you and this people are with you, for this thing is too burdensome for you. You are not able to perform it alone. And in verse 19, it goes on to pick up that what Moses ends up doing is he picks judges to help take on these tasks. And he kind of becomes the Supreme Court in a sense, where if there's ever a decision where they can't come to it, they can then bring it to him. But you can imagine all the people that left Egypt, and we know some of them died and what have you. But that's a lot of people for one person to be responsible for. This system that was set up by Moses appeared to be the one that seeks God's laws and his statutes, not majority rule. And that was the system that, was a righteous system. But we also know that these judges would have to rely on God giving them wisdom, and it might not always be something that's written in the law or the statutes. Let's go over to 1 Kings and read a couple of scriptures. In 1 Kings chapter 3, and 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 6. And Solomon said, you have shown to your servant David, my father, great mercy, according as he walked before you in the truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of the heart with you. And you have kept this great kindness for him, that you have given him a son to sit on the throne as it is today. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of David, my father. And I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in. You know, a young child David was. And in your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, numerous people who cannot be numbered, nor counted for multitude. Now therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this, your great people? And the word was good in the eyes of the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this thing and not asked for yourself long life, and have not asked for riches for yourself, have not asked for life of your enemies, but have asked for understanding to judge justly. Think about that. He could have asked for anything. And that showed his heart. Because when he had this opportunity to ask, what did he ask for? He asked for the ability to discern between good and evil so that he could be a righteous judge. That's powerful. You know, Solomon realized that he was like a child and that he was being given this huge task of judging God's people. And this is a perfect example of a servant of God being honest with God, going to God, asking God for what they need. You know, when we're honest with God, we're humble. And that's exactly what he was doing. And dropping down, let's drop down to verse 27. Then the king answered and said, give her the living child and in no way kill it. She is the mother of it. Now, I put this in here because this is one of those famous sayings that took place where you had two women that were both claiming that the baby was theirs. And there was really, you know, today we have DNA testing and maternity testing, but both of these ladies were claiming that that baby was theirs. And what did Solomon do? He said, cut the baby in half, and you can have half, and you can have half. And the woman that said, no, she can have the baby, he knew that was the mother. That's wisdom. It's terrible, but it's wisdom. And so what we see here in verse 27, that the king answered and said, give her the living child and in no way kill it. She is the mother of it. And that's the kind of wisdom that we need to be able to make righteous judgment. You know, things are not always as they seem. You know, let's go over to Matthew chapter, we look here, put this, kind of jumped ahead of myself. What a blessing it would be to have an understanding heart to judge as Solomon did. And even in that little example, but in every aspect of our life, every year we observe God's holy days. And we learn a great deal of God's plan as we go through those. Now, right now, we're kind of in a little resting period until Passover comes back around. And God's holy plan, you know, starts all over again. We just went through the Feast of Tabernacles in the last great day, as Neil even brought up. But, you know, the Feast of Tabernacles is a time in the future that will actually happen one day here on this earth. You know, when we look at Passover, it's one of those days that we can actually say, well, the Old Testament Passover, and then we also see when Christ was here. That day has been fulfilled, you know, and it's still being fulfilled as we take it every year. But the Feast of Tabernacles, that has not occurred yet. And what we look at here is the Feast of Tabernacles is a time in the future that will actually happen on this earth. And it's going to occur right after a group of people that are on this earth have went through living hell. Bloodshed, destruction, pestilence, famine, all the millions of people that have died, where it talks about the blood being in the valley up to a bridle strap on a horse. That's a lot of death. And it's true that it will be a time of wisdom and judgment. And we sing like the song that we sang today about, oh, how I love thy law. And if we understand correctly, those people that will be in the first resurrection will have a great job to help Christ. But what kind of wisdom and judgment will be needed? during that time period, after these people have just went through such destruction and seen loved ones die and had people betray them and just all kinds of terrible things that they may have seen. You know, you may have been in a bad car wreck before where for a long period of time, maybe you still have nightmares, or maybe you've seen something terrible happen before and it just affects you. Imagine what these people are going to have encountered, because the earth was literally shook off its foundation. Let's go to Matthew chapter 23. And I wanted to read this because when we talk about wisdom, righteous judgment, and also being in a position to judge, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And when we look at Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23, we look at those that were in that seat of judgment in Christ's time. And what Christ said to him, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you pay tithes of mint and anise and cumin, but you have abandoned the more important matters of the law." And I want to stop there for a second. So in other words, I know we watched a video where we talked about sweat the small stuff, right? Well, that's exactly what the scribes and Pharisees did. They sweated the small stuff, but they omitted the big. They abandoned the big stuff. We don't want to be in that boat either, because what we see here, it says that they would look at you and say, "Hey, you're not tithing enough. You're not doing this. You're not doing that." But then what does it say? They abandoned the more important matters of the law, which was judgment, mercy, and faith. These you were obligated to do and not to leave the others undone. Blind guides who filter out a gnat but swallow a camel. And we see that, you know. There's various things that people will say, you know, don't throw rocks if you got a glass house or what have you, all those different sayings, right? That's exactly what they were doing. And the weightier matters of the law, being judgment, mercy, and faith, our God is a God of love and mercy. And sometimes more can be taught by a hug or just by listening than by telling a person their faults or throwing the book at them, as some would say in court. You know, we're going to throw the book at this one. Judgment is we know right from wrong and that we choose right regardless. That's not what Pilate did. Pilate knew what was right, but Pilate chose wrong because of a crowd, because of peer pressure. And we don't need to judge Pilate, because guess what? You and I have probably done that before too. Mercy is we understand that people are weak, just as we are, and that they make mistakes, but also sometimes people have to do the best with what they have. And that's a big part of mercy. People have to do the best with what they have and what they know. I remember being a young kid wondering, this is one of those things, if Philip was here, he would probably laugh. But one of those things that as a little kid, you know, because one of the first things you learn as you're coming up and in the church is, I don't eat pork. And that's a big deal in the world, right? People are like, you don't eat pork? What are you, Muslim? You get that a lot, right? Well, one of the questions, these are the $1 million questions when you're growing up, that your friends will ask you. Ben, all right, I got a question for you. All right. You're on an island. You're starving to death. There's no way you can get off the island. You're sitting there by the fire trying to stay warm, and a baby pig just walks up and drops down beside you. You haven't eaten in days. Are you going to take that pig and kill it and roast it? Now, it's a $1 million question, right? Well, that's why I don't go to islands anymore. Nah, I'm just kidding. But those are the kind of questions you got. You've all gotten them before, right? That's the ox in the ditch, isn't it? Well, one, I would hope and pray that God would never put me in that situation. But if I was in that situation, it's really a silly question. But if there was no other way, would that not be very similar to eating the showbread? It was forbidden to eat, just like David did. He was starving, you know. But that's the question that people will ask. It's a foolish question. But that's the kind of things that you think about. And that's where you come into mercy, right? You come into mercy. And I think we've all, whether on purpose or accident, eaten a piece of pork before, right? And, you know, that doesn't seal the deal, okay? But that's mercy. That's an example of mercy. You know, might not be the best example, but it's one that I put down here. Faith. Faith is interesting because we immediately begin to say, when we're looking at judgment, mercy, and faith, when we think of faith, the first thing that pops in your mind is, oh yeah, faith in God. I have faith in God. Well, I don't know if that's the actual thing of what we're talking about here. It's when you're a judge, you have to have faith in people. Think about that for a moment. You're a judge. You got somebody standing in front of you. I don't know. You know, they've got a bunch of speeding tickets. And for whatever reason, you want to give him or her a chance. And so you tell them, we'll let you off. And I have faith in you. I'm giving you an opportunity here. But if you get another speeding ticket, you know, and everybody on the council might go, what, are you crazy? He speeds all the time. But sometimes you have to have faith in people. You have to give people an opportunity to make right decisions. We got to have faith in God, but that's also something that we have to understand as being a judge. We have to be able to practice mercy. We have to sometimes give people opportunities, or what you would say is faith. Give them, you know, I got faith in you. You're going to do the right thing. Now, they might not do the right thing, but you gave them the opportunity. It might not be, you know, giving them a chance because God gives us chances every day, right? Let's go to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 35. And in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 35, we read another instance of Christ, and it says, Then Jesus went around to all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every bodily weakness among the people. Christ was ministering to people, but it wasn't just always reading the scripture. He was also physically helping them. And that's why I said sometimes giving a person a hug might be better than a Bible verse. You know, Christ, as we see here in the scripture, healing diseases, bodily weaknesses. How many of those people, and there's no way for us to know this answer, only Christ knows, but do you think any of those people that Christ healed maybe went their own way and never followed him again? I'm certain there's several of them that did. And that was the chance that Christ took because he put faith in them. He gave them an opportunity to follow him. But guess what? They maybe chose to go the other way. And we know that. I didn't write this scripture down, but one of them is an example right after he fed them. It said a great multitude left and didn't follow him from that day forward. But he still gave them an opportunity, and he was merciful. You know, every year I have a little small garden in my backyard. I've skipped it a couple of times. But when I say it's a small garden, I can go out back and I can pull all the vegetables off my little plants, whatever I have planted that year, and I can pull up some weeds, trim it back, and I can do that within a few minutes. It's a small garden, right? You know, but imagine if my garden was 5 acres. That's a lot of land. And imagine if I was trying to maintain it and manage it by myself. Now, there's some people that say, oh, that could be done. But it'd be a lot of work. It'd be a lot of work. Where my little garden, I can go out there and, you know, pretty quick. 5 acres? That's a lot. That'd be a lot of work for one person. And this is one of the reasons why Christ is the firstborn among many brethren. You know, you think about that. He's the firstborn. The fact that he's the firstborn means that there's going to be others born. And that's you and I. He's our elder brother. If we understand correctly, there is coming a time in the future, which is what the Feast of Tabernacles represents, that this situation will be the case again. But Christ this time will have workers for the harvest. And that's one of the things. Well, we just read in 35, look at 36. And seeing the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were wearied and scattered abroad as sheep who did not have a shepherd. That might be exactly the same scenario after Christ returns. People scattered, you know, sick, hurt. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is truly great, but the workmen are few. The workmen are few. In other words, 5 acres is a lot to work for one man or one lady. And when we think about the Feast of Tabernacles, that opportunity is not going to be like my little garden. And it's going to be a whole lot bigger than 5 acres. And so we see here that Christ, being the firstborn, one of the reasons why he came was to grow that family of workmen to help with this harvest that's coming in the future, of people that are going to have witnessed some terrible things. And what are they going to practice? The exact thing that the Pharisees and Sadducees didn't. Judgment, mercy, and faith. Could this be you? What makes you qualified? Well, we must not forget if we're serving in God's kingdom, it's not something we earn. It's because God gave it to us. It's grace. We can't earn salvation. Let's go over to Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4 and read something that we've read before, but it's just a good reminder. Could you be qualified? Well, the fact that you're alive today actually means you're going through the qualification process. And that's something that you and I sometimes forget. But in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 14, it says, having therefore a great high priest, and this is Christ, who is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, we should hold fast the confession of our faith. Here's 15. This is crucial for us to never forget. For we do not have a high priest who cannot empathize, tongue-tied, empathize, I can't say it, my bad, with our weaknesses, but one who is tempted in all things according to the likeness of our own temptations, yet he was without sin. So the fact that Christ came in the flesh allowed him to be able to understand what you and I go through. The fact that you and I are in the flesh today is setting us up for that same ability for people in the future. Christ came in the flesh, and there's a big difference there in 15, and it's right there at the end. He was tempted in all things according to the likeness of our own temptations, yet he was without sin. Every one of us in this room has sinned. We're not perfect. He came and experienced those temptations and overcame them 100%. But what it did is it validated him to be able to look at God the Father when we're standing before him and say, I understand this temptation that Ben Franklin went through, or this person or that person. I experienced that same temptation. We're going to forgive him or her because he walked in our shoes. That's huge. And you think about that for a moment. Before Christ died on the stake, he didn't have that experience. He didn't have that experience of what it's like to have people spitting on you or lying about you or wanting you dead. He had never experienced that before because he was part of the God family. But he was experiencing it in the flesh. The people that he came to save were wanting him dead. And many other temptations that he had. We know the examples of where Satan, took him to the top of mountains and what have you and offered him the world. He was tempted much greater than any of us have ever been tempted for anything. But he was tempted with all points, yet without sin. Christ is and was without sin, but the fact that he walked in our shoes, it allows us to relate to him. Today, we're in the flesh, and that's something we have to remember. We're in the flesh, and our walk is preparing us. What is our challenge? What is it that you struggle with? And it might be multiple things. And it might be something that you struggle with today that 10 years from now, you don't struggle with that no more. It's a new thing. Multiple struggles. Because it actually helps to know that the thing that you're having to work so hard to overcome is actually what you might be preparing for one day in the future to help somebody else with. It's almost like we're going through a class. It's an instruction. It really puts a new perspective on life and purpose, right? Because the things in which we are having to overcome today are the things that one day might be our strengths that we're used to help others with. Might not be, right? And I put this out there too because we don't know all things. The thing that you think is the hardest that you're having to overcome, God may say, that's not your biggest problem. This is your biggest problem. Because we don't know. But it's doing the same thing with us that we see here in Hebrews. We're walking that path. And so one day when we're resurrected or when we're changed in the twinkling of an eye, and we're put into spiritual bodies, we're able to look at people that are going through something and relate to them. And that's exactly what Christ is able to do today. And that's powerful. It's a powerful opportunity for us. I meant to bring this, but I didn't. I didn't have time. But you take a jar and you fill it full of marbles, all the same color. But in that jar, you got one marble that's a different color, right? And all those marbles that are in that jar represent your sins. And we got a bunch. And you got the little sin of when you were 6 years old, you stole a candy bar. But you don't worry about that one too much, do you? Because God is not going to condemn you to hell for stealing a candy bar when you're 6 years old. That's just mentally what you kind of accept. I'm good on that one. And then you got that other sin in the jar, right? It's that time you ran the stop sign. Or that time you told your mom you folded the clothes and you really didn't fold the clothes. You lied. And we can go through all these little marbles, right? But eventually, we get to that one marble that's in that jar. It's the different color one. And that's different for every person. And that's the big one. Whatever it is for you. And that's the one that one day when you're standing before God the Father, that you're really, really nervous about. And you know what? That's when you get to see God's mercy. You see it on all the others too. But that's that one. And you got to let that one go because as we see in the scripture, Paul stood there and watched Timothy get stoned to death. Because that was before he was a follower of Christ. So he stood there and watched a Christian get murdered and took part in it. I've never talked to Paul, but I'm assuming that might be his color marble or one of them, because it followed him wherever he went. It bothered him. And the thing about that is if we learn to practice forgiveness and mercy and be humble and righteous judgment to others, then God says he'll give it to us. That's important. It's very important. Let's go to Psalms chapter 37. Psalms chapter 37. You can't expect mercy if you don't practice mercy. And you can't expect forgiveness if you don't give forgiveness. In Psalms chapter 37 and verse 27, we're going to read a few scriptures. It says, "Depart from evil and do good, and live forevermore. For the Lord loves justice and does not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the seed of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the earth and dwell in it forever. The mouth of the righteous speaks wisdom, and his tongues talk of justice. The law of God is in his heart, and none of his steps shall slide." It's good that we want the law of God to be in our heart. And we know that one day, if we understand correctly, if we're in that first resurrection, Christ will have workers that have lived their lives as human beings, and they have experiences of temptations and sins. They're not perfect. Christ was perfect. He was the firstborn. These individuals won't be blind judges. They'll be able to give advice based on experience. And that's important, to be able to relate to a person. You know, when you can maybe look at a person, let's say you've been homeless before. You can talk to a homeless person because you know where they are. You've been there before. You can relate. We can go down the list of all kinds of different things. They will walk in the law of God. They will also practice the weightier matters of the law: judgment, mercy, faith. You remember the Pharisees. They wanted to, focus on all the little details and forget the weightier matters. I'm not saying we're not supposed to focus on the details, but I'm saying that there's a reason why the judgment seat was on top of the ark, the mercy seat, because mercy becomes the top of it. So what is God preparing you for in the future? And we don't know at this time. But regardless of what it is, it requires you and me to have an understanding heart. You've got to have an understanding heart. We don't understand why things happen the way they do. We don't understand why this is that and that's that, or what have you. But God will work it out. We've got to have faith in that. Judgment, mercy, and faith, the weightier matters of the law, is something we all need to be familiar with, especially if we plan to be in that role one day in the future. We don't know if we will be, but if we're going to be, that's an important thing. The ability to be able to practice forgiveness, righteous judgment using God's law, mercy, a big part of it. That's one of the things that Christ taught us, turn the other cheek. And, those are various examples. When they brought the woman before him, and he said, "You without sin cast the first stone." These are all examples of mercy. And that's not something that was being practiced back then, but that's something that we're hopefully going to be practicing in the future. And so hopefully when you think more about the Feast of Tabernacles, I know that's our most recent holy day that we just went through. Those days, we don't know when they're going to be here. Might be in our lifetime, might not be in our lifetime. But it'll be a wonderful opportunity because we won't have to rely on the judicial system that we have today. We won't have to rely on the system that Christ relied on that day with Pilate. It'll be a perfect system. It'll be God's system of judging the heart. Judging the heart.